So, what we lastly discussed was the capillaries, and now we're discussing the vessels, the lymphatic vessels. Right. So, once more, we do know that lymph is captured by the lymphatic capillaries and that it's transported through the lymphatic vessels, which this is just a loose diagram about those. And it travels through those to our lymph nodes. But we're not going to get into that. We're simply just discussing the lymphatic vessels themselves, how they operate, how the lymph moves through them, as well as the distinction between the vessel and the capillaries. Okay, good. So one of the distinctions we did discuss in the last video was that the lymphatic vessels are actually thicker than the lymphatic capillaries. That's very important to know, just because you don't want to mix the two up. If you're staring at an image or a diagram, you will always know that your lymphatic vessels will be thicker than your lymphatic capillaries. In terms of movement, we do know that lymph travels through the lymphatic vessels to reach the lymphatic node, but liquid doesn't travel on its own. So we need to understand how lymph moves through those vessels. So one thing to note is that the lymphatic vessel actually has thin flap-like structures, right? And those react to pressure. It allows lymph to move through them, but it doesn't allow it to escape back out the way that it came, right? So it kind of works similar to the endothelial cells of the capillaries, except these are not endothelial cells. These are just flap-like structures. They're flap-like cellular structures. But fluid enters. There are two reasons why the fluid is moving through the lymphatic vessels. There is our extrinsic forces, which are forces outside of the vessel. Things like the surrounding muscle and tissue contracting, which creates pressure and that pushes the lymph through the lymphatic vessel, and our intrinsic forces. So basically how the lymph moves using forces inside of the vessel. So the vessel actually has smooth muscle inside of it. And that smooth muscle actually rhythmically contracts the same way the heart does. We call that smooth muscles lymphangions. So when that smooth muscle contracts, kind of like a heart does, it's still rhythmic, it actually aids in pushing the lymph through the lymphatic vessels. All right? And that's generally the basis. It's not too much detail for the lymphatic vessel. It's pretty straightforward in terms of its movement and its purpose. It's used to transport. Another thing I wanted to note, because I did mention the lymphatic node, is that the lymphatic capillaries and I forgot the name of the cell already. The flap-like cells that we have here, the endothelial cells that we have, don't have a filter. So that means not only are we taking in that lymph, which is just plasma and a couple other materials, but it's mainly plasma. Not only are we taking in that lymph, we also are taking in things like pathogens, bacteria, and debris. I use debris loosely. It's not actual debris, of course. But since we don't have a filter for the entrance of the lymphatic capillaries, we need a way to cleanse the lymph before placing it back into the bloodstream. And that's where our lymphatic nodes come into play. So that's the importance of the nodes, and that's why they're there, is because we don't actually have a filtration point at the beginning of the lymphatic system. So we have a security checkpoints, which are those nodes that are used to cleanse the lymph of things like pathogens. So that's one of the purposes of that. That'll be the next video that we get into. But for now, that's generally the synopsis on the lymphatic vessels. Is there the differentiation in size? They're thicker than lymphatic capillaries. How they move the fluid along, that fluid being lymph, how they move that fluid. It has its smooth muscle, which we call angions, inside of the lymphatic vessel. And those rhythmically contract, similar to how the heart does. Those are our intrinsic forces. Our extrinsic forces are the surrounding outside of the vessel. Outside of the vessel, those are our surrounding muscle and tissue that also contract and create pressure that moves lymph forward as well. I believe that's everything so far. This is just a pretty brief overview. It doesn't have to be too detailed. That's what our textbook is for. is for greater detail, but this is kind of just to give you a better depiction of how that system operates.